So this video isn't exactly one of our normal steps. It's a detailed install video of our Cape Horn Wind Vane. So if you're not really interested, maybe skip this one. If you are interested in how we installed it and how we went about it for our particular boat, stay tuned and I hope you enjoy it.
After 2 years of sailing with our temperamental wheel pilot, it was time for a long-awaited upgrade. Finally, our new Cape Horn Wind Vane had arrived, and we couldn't wait to install it.
Good morning, everyone. I have got our new wind vane from Cape Horn laid out beside me here. It's very simple, but it takes kind of a complicated problem and turns it into a beautifully crafted piece of hardware. It comes in just a few pieces: the main vertical shaft, the two wind vanes, the servo pendulum, and then the horizontal mounting tube and all the hardware that goes inside of it, and then some support brackets, and that's about it. I've read the instruction manual here about a dozen times. I downloaded the PDF a few months ago, and I've been studying it ever since. The most nerve-wracking part of that is going to be drilling a 2.5-inch hole in the back of the transom. So first I'm going to measure twice and cut once. I'm going to measure 9 times, make sure everything's level and aligned and perfect before I start drilling holes in the transom. But once that's done, everything else goes into place pretty quick. So let's get started.
The amazing thing with the Cape Horn, it comes in 2 different sizes, and each unit is custom made to your boat. You send them some basic measurements, and they fabricate the unit to fit your boat like a glove.
Well, I tied this string off to the helm and centered the helm, and then I tied it to the center of the backstay, and it's going to represent the center line of our boat, or at least as close to center as I can get it. And now if I can level this as well, then it'll be level to the water line, and I can start taking measurements off of it. This piece of string right here is everything. It's like the most important thing in this whole install. Well, I've got all of the measuring done and picked a good spot to drill the first pilot hole through. So I'm going to start with about a 1/4-inch hole and then thread this carbon fiber arrow shaft through it. And then I'll be able to test to make sure everything's aligned and everything's going to fit. I'll test fit the quadrant on the shaft to make sure everything looks like it's going to line up before I drill the big 2.5-inch hole through. Here goes nothing. The next step is installing this. This is the horizontal axis where all of the control through to the quadrant goes. This middle piece here is the horizontal mounting tube, and I need to take the horizontal axis out of it so that I can mount this through the hole in the back of the transom, and use these mounting struts to attach it to the back of the boat. It's probably easier said than done. These are the bolts that hold the quadrant on. Now that's off. This should slide right out of there. This does have a fore and an aft side. They've labeled it fore and aft, but also the bushing on the fore end is a little bit smaller, and the bushing on the aft end has been sort of tapered a little bit so that these welds don't rub up against the bushing. Pretty smart. They kind of thought things through. On the inside of the transom, I'm going to mount the forward end of the horizontal mounting tube with these 2 struts. They've got sort of like a turnbuckle. This end gets mounted to the tube. This little backing plate goes on the inside of the tube. It's got some self-adhesive tape on there so you can stick it to the inside of the tube and it won't go anywhere, so it lines up just nice. And then you adjust the length by threading this in and out, so you can get a pretty precise fit. And the other end of this gets mounted with this little plate here, and that's going to be mounted up underneath the deck somewhere to make the forward end of this mounting tube very secure, because it takes a lot of torque from the quadrant. It also takes a lot of drag from the servo pendulum dragging through the water, so it needs to be really, really secure. All right, well, I've got the horizontal mounting tube pretty much installed, and these support brackets are keeping it in place. It's level, it's true to the keel, and the last step to install it permanently is to run a little bit of fiberglass and some epoxy around here to keep it very secure. But before I do that, I'm going to sort of dry fit the rest of the pieces to make sure everything's actually level and plumb and true and square and everything before I glass this in. Well, I'm getting ready to attach the very last support bracket for the tower of the wind vane. And these brackets get mounted on the actual tower itself, and then there's kind of like a turnbuckle, I guess, so you can adjust, so you can fine tune the length of this rod. And these have a backing plate, a threaded backing plate that goes on the inside of the pipe, so that it has something really solid to be screwed in or bolted into. Problem is that the holes are halfway up, and so you have to bring this backing plate somehow up the inside of that tube and hold it in place while you bolt the bracket on. There's a trick for it, and it's actually in the instructions for installation. And so I know that I normally MacGyver and DIY the heck out of stuff, but this one's actually straight out of the instruction manual. So the trick is a piece of string and a tiny little screw. This little screw with this little string goes through the hole that I just drilled in the tower there, and then you drop it all the way down to the bottom, and when it comes out the bottom, you thread it through the top hole of the backing plate, and then you pull it tight so it creates like a little bit of a toggle, and then you pull it all the way back up inside of that pipe until it's in place. And then you put the bottom bolt in and hold it tight. I'm using a much longer bolt here to hold this in position, so I have like a handle. And now that I have it locked in, I can drop the thread and the string back through to the bottom, theoretically, if I can get it out of there. There we go. And then I can pull it out the bottom. Groovy.
There you go.
Done. It's a sweet little trick, but unless they told me that in the directions, I don't think I'd be able to figure it out on my own. You're also technically supposed to be installing this thing backed up against like a dock or something with the boat tied really steady, but we don't have one of those, so we're doing the entire installation off the back of the boat, and so far we haven't needed to go in the dinghy once, which is pretty sweet. The last piece to installing the horizontal mounting tube is this little cap that goes all the way on the aft end. You can see one side's been cut down and one side's a little bit longer. This side goes to port, so that this side where that pin and rod come down have space to move up and down. I don't think you can actually install it backwards, but the thick side goes to port. Well, everything's starting to look pretty good. I've got the whole thing sort of test fit together, and everything's square and lined up and true. And so the last step that I'm going to do today is put a little bit of epoxy and fiberglass around where the horizontal mounting tube goes through the transom. That way it'll secure it up really nice and solid. So first I need to grind and kind of rough up the stainless steel around the perimeter, and then put a little bit of thickened epoxy on it and put some fiberglass on it. I've been trying to figure out how to attach the wind vane onto our Quadrant sort of all morning with multiple different variations. But I was kind of set on building something like this, taking it to the machine shop, building out of like stainless and having the two pulleys attach up underneath somewhere like that. But that involves a machine shop and waiting for them to be done with it and money and blah blah blah. But instead, I think I'll be able to install like an eye bolt down here, and then on the other side have an eye bolt up here, so that the rope pulling at one direction will be on top like this, and the rope pulling at the other direction will be underneath like this, and we'll still have enough space that it's not going to rub. That's my theory. But by leaving one on the top and having one underneath, then they're not going to chafe. Which is sweet. Just does the battery, Dad. Look at that.
I used the time while the epoxy cured on the mounting tube to install the control lines from the Quadrant to the cockpit. It's important to minimize chafe anytime the line comes in contact with another surface, but since this section of line doesn't move back and forth, no pulleys are needed, just some fair leads to guide it.
Well, I'm getting ready to install the control line for our new wind vane. The stuff we chose is a double braid, and it has a Dyneema core. So it's going to be zero stretch, which is good because it has a lot of force on it. It's really pretty rope. 1/4 inch. The Dyneema core is really strong too. Well, the horizontal mounting tube is all solidly mounted to the transom now. The support brackets are all tight, the fiberglass is all hard, and the Quadrant's installed. So the next thing on the list is going to be finish installing the control lines, which means adding 2 more blocks, one somewhere up about here, and then one back here to line it up with the Quadrant.
The last set of blocks needed some custom mounts made to firmly secure them to the transom. I countersunk the bolt heads into the back and added some cut grooves for the epoxy to fill into. The alignment here is crucial to avoid chafing.
The Cape Horn comes with 2 wind vanes, a light weather, like 0 to probably 15 knots of wind or so until you take your first reef, and then you replace it with this one that's made out of aluminum, which is for heavy weather. And this is the crescent that sits on the top, and it's actually what kind of swings back and forth. And this piece that slides up and down, and this cotter pin go aft. And this piece of bungee cord here goes forward. And on here, the writing goes forward, the pointy bit and the holes go back. And then that little thumb screw goes through to the threaded side on the other side there. These are the counterweights that counterbalance the big long rod that goes down through the vertical tower on the back. They're custom set at the factory, and I've been instructed not to touch them. All right, this part up here is what controls the angle to the wind by turning it. It has a hook in the back, and this part points up and forward. It goes into that little hole right there. And then this part hooks on here. This piece slides up. This pin, you have to rotate it down, locks this hook together. There we go. That gets locked together, and a piece of bungee cord holds it in. That's it. It goes like that into the wind when you're sailing. This piece of bungee cord right here goes through this little nylon loop. It helps adjust the yaw while you're sailing downwind so you don't overcorrect. And this is where the magic happens. This is the servo pendulum that goes in the water. And when the vane at the top turns, it twists this ever so slightly and it causes it to swing up and down through the water. And all of that hydraulic force is what's applied to our quadrant. And it just kind of snaps on with this bungee cord back here, so that if you hit something and it doesn't bend, it'll just pop this thing off. Safety cords on it, so it'll just sit there and swing, and then you can reinstall it. So if you hit like a log or something when you're sailing through the water, it won't bend and break all this stuff on the back.
Yeah.
Okay, so the theory is you rotate this whole top piece into the wind so that this stands up and down. That's when you're on your right point of sail. Then this will fall over, the wind's pushing on this side until it comes back around, or if it's the other way, it'll push it this way. And that motion of it swinging back and forth relays the message down through here to the servo in the water. And it turns it ever so slightly. It doesn't need much. And that small amount of rotation pushes that servo out from side to side, kind of like sticking your hand out the window in a car. When you tip your hand up, it goes up. When you push your hand down, it goes down. It's the same theory. It only really works when you're sailing and there's movement through the water though. Now, so when you're helming the boat and you're on your point of sail and the sails are well trimmed and the servo's vertical in the water and the rudder's about vertical in the water, you reach down here and you pull up tight on the control lines, which tighten all the lines back to our quadrant, back to the Cape Horn quadrant. And now, theoretically, if we were sailing, the wind would take over and the Cape Horn would start steering our boat. You can rotate this whole thing up and kind of tie it off somewhere like that. Take the vane off the top, and that's how it stores for like short periods of time. Obviously, if like now we're at anchor for 4 or 5 weeks, we'd take the whole thing off, I think. And that was it. The install went pretty well. It only took 3 days. A little present day update. Since the install, we've actually sailed about 500 miles with it, and it's worked flawlessly. So stay tuned every Thursday for our upcoming videos, and you can see how it works and how we use it. But until then, see you next time.